Hey guys, Matt, just about a minute and a half of introduction before I begin reading chapter 22. As a reminder, the entire front section of the book, which is massive, maybe 50 chapters, is just presenting the fraud of this world and is meant for the newer person in this journey. I figured at some point when I wrote the book, you have to just give people overwhelming evidence that almost every aspect of this world is some sort of fraud. It's overwhelming evidence. And in this subsection, starting in chapter 17, I believe it is, the Statue of Liberty lie, this is where you could sit someone down, starting with chapter 17, through this chapter, and say, the most basic elements of what you understand life to be in this country are all lies and easily provable lies. What's the Statue of Liberty? Oh, I know what that is. No, you don't. What's money? I know what that is. No, you don't. What's the Fed? See, the basics. This section is the basics. I don't know how anybody, even somebody not even open to conspiracy, could get through chapter 17 through 22 here, come out the other end, and say, oh yeah, life's just like Anderson Cooper presents it. That's the purpose of this subsection. The fraud of the world will continue with subsequent chapters. The last chapter about that conversation or mock conversation between one soul thinking about entering the realm of earth, that dialogue is in the book, but it's in the back section, the where we explore big ideas, the positives, the better news is in the back section. I move that up just to mix it in. You can't just do the fraud of this world for 50 chapters in a row. Why is the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C.? This is yet another story that should be obvious to every child in the country, yet almost no one in America knows anything about it. Remember the point of this section? You know next to nothing about the world in which you live. Here's even more proof. When you research this topic online, why is the Capitol in D.C.? You'll find a bunch of mumbo jumbo about a compromise being needed where northern politicians had to appease southern ones, and all the related assumptions about assuming state debt on the federal level and blah, 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 blah. All bullcrap, as usual. Like much of school taught history, it's bullcrap. Think about this for a moment. Use your inner wisdom. Tap into it. You're allowed. Even if you've been brainwashed never to touch what we call inner knowing, it is a skill that can be learned. It will show you the answer. So we have a new, massive country now up and running, and they chose a swampy, out of the way place for the capital with no direct access to the sea, far away from everything important like Charleston, New York, and Philadelphia. Perhaps the founding fathers just knew that air travel was only about 100 years away, and they were very patient men. After about 1776, you could have purchased oodles of acres in that area, the area where Washington, D.C. is today, for a few dollars. There was nothing there. To put it professionally, the land was absolute shit. Agreed, the land where Washington, D.C. resides is just about an hour carriage ride from George Washington's Mount Vernon, Virginia plantation. But do you think they would install a nation's capital for the next 1,000 years for the sake of an old man's convenience in his last year or last few years of life? He was dying at that point. Do you even think old George would even demand they do that? It had nothing to do with the location of where George Washington's plantation was. The only facts we have about the chosen site are all very strange ones that point to a parallel between Washington, D.C. and the Vatican/Rome. Washington, D.C. is clearly a tribute to Rome, or an extension of Rome itself. You really won't believe what follows. First, let's look at this bizarre fact. The Vatican is a completely autonomous area inside of Rome, Italy. It's considered its own country from a legal perspective. If you were a pickpocket running from the Italian police after stealing a purse and you managed to leap across the gate to Vatican City, I know that's impossible. The gates are probably 50 feet tall, but say you could leap across a gate and you got into Vatican City, the Rome police couldn't even follow you in to arrest you. They have zero authority, 1 foot inside the wall of the Vatican. The second Da Vinci Code movie, Angels and Demons, actually does a pretty good job portraying the relationship between the Vatican police and the Swiss Guard, who are not just ceremonial figures. As strange as their costumes appear, Swiss Guard have real power. Washington, D.C. is also separate from the states and under no state laws. It's similar in legal status to the Vatican and the relationship the Vatican has to Italy. The Washington, D.C. corporation is not even technically part of the United States, or at least that could be argued. The strange parallels between Washington, D.C. and Rome are beyond shocking. Before it was named after the first president, the D.C. area on the old map from 1700 was actually called Rome. D.C. was called Rome on the map. That gets us started. The river running through D.C. is called the Tiber. The famous Tiber River runs through Rome and right by the Vatican. Rome is called the City of Seven Hills. The D.C. area had the same name, Seven Hills. Washington, D.C. was born of the Virgin Mary. What the heck am I talking about? Virginia and Maryland, of course. It's no coincidence D.C. sits between these two states, aptly named for the Virgin Mary. Do you know how many Americans would relate the state names of Virginia and Maryland to the Virgin Mary? Few people have ever noticed that. Well, I guess I'm some conspiracy theorist. I'm just making it up. It's obvious to anybody new listening to this when you think it through. Virginia and Maryland, Virgin Mary, D.C. birthed in the middle. Everything they do is by ceremony and ritual and some bizarre occult nature. So this, quote, District of Columbia was birthed by the Virgin Mary between these two states. You'll soon see that the consequence of this world is ruled by symbolism. Symbols that the great unwashed just think are pretty little shapes drawn for fun. One of the most famous sites in Rome is Capitoline Hill, originally a worship site to the god Saturn. Just by coincidence, I'm sure, we have Capitol Hill as the seat of power in the United States. We've heard the famous Roman Senate, or of it. What does the United States call its most powerful body? The Senate. All major buildings and monuments in Washington, D.C. are 100% Roman in architecture. In another connection to Rome, we have John Carroll as one of the richest men in America at the time and supposedly one of the only Catholic founding fathers, donating a lot of land to construct the nation's new capital. What language appears on the dollar bill? The Latin of ancient Rome is on the dollar bill. Why would that be? Don't we speak English here? Well, we used to. Now we speak Spanish. The strangest one, hidden in plain sight, is the Roman fasces, or fascia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Fascia is the symbol of the bundled twigs with an axe blade at the top, depicted on one end, the axe blade, per the bundle. It may have been an ancient weapon, but you can quite get a square answer as to what it was. But it doesn't matter what it was. Have you ever watched the President's State of the Union speech? Where there's two giant fascia behind the President in the House chambers, mounted right to the wall. It's yet another blatant Roman symbol carried forth into the United States. It gets even stranger. The symbol of the fascia is the universal symbol for, you guessed it, fascism. Why wouldn't that be hanging behind the president during the State of the Union address? It makes sense. Upon examining the fourth or maybe the fifth parallel between Rome and Washington, D.C., one can clearly see that D.C. was designed to be an extension of Rome and the Vatican itself. It's almost obvious if you spend 5 minutes. How many Americans have? Next to nobody. They go up into the Washington Monument as tourists and have no friggin' clue what's going on. The Vatican places itself in the role of the world's spiritual center. London, and more specifically the autonomous city of London, is the world's financial epicenter, and Washington, D.C. in the United States is the muscle. It's a three-legged stool I call a monster. Let's consider this. How is this obvious Washington, D.C. to Rome tribute even possible if 90% of the founding fathers were supposedly not Roman Catholic? It doesn't seem to add up, does it? And this is for the three people still claiming all of this is a coincidence. Let's just examine this strange example. What if the area, just go out on a limb here, what if the area the founding fathers chose way back when for the new United States Capitol was in Ohio, for example, and that area just happened to be on the old maps called Mecca. And it had a river that ran through it called the Nile, and it was full of pyramids. And that area, west of the Ohio River was called the Arabian Plateau. Would that affect your perception of maybe why they chose that area for the U.S. capital? What if looking back, all the modern architecture they built in our new Ohio capital then was ziggurats, minarets, and gold dome mosques framed in the crescent moon? What if there was a curved sword behind the president during the State of the Union address? What's your threshold before you begin to make a connection and stop screaming conspiracy theorist at me? And very quickly, going back to the religion of the founding fathers, we're told everybody coming out of England at the time is Protestant, so the founding fathers must have been Protestant. And I'm no religion expert, but I don't buy it. You don't have a bunch of Protestant founding fathers, and John Carroll's just the only Catholic, and the entire construction of DC, almost everything about it screams of Rome. No, I don't buy just a bunch of English Protestants coming out, fighting the Revolutionary War. And they were building the White House when John Adams, the second president, was in office. They were building it. So this happened very, very quickly after the Revolutionary War. It's not like, oh, there were Protestants, Matt, and then, the Catholics took over. No, of course, the entire story of what we're told about almost everything is utter bullshit. Covered in a prior section, but it's very relevant here. Let's talk about it quickly one more time. The Washington Monument, as mentioned, is an Egyptian obelisk. This symbol has no link to America's founding, heritage, culture, or history. It's 100% tied to ancient Egypt and the god Osiris, particularly his phallus region, or penis. So what the hell is it doing on our National Mall? It's not small. Let's go see this little thing. It's like the largest thing that was ever built at the time it was built. Didn't the Freemasons who constructed Washington, D.C. understand that that obelisk is the symbol of a dick? And if not Osiris's own Magic Johnson, then at least a general fertility symbol as old as time itself. Of course, the Freemasons with genius IQs knew exactly what they were constructing. I've not broken with the theme of drawing parallels between Washington, D.C. and the Vatican by including the Washington Monument in this discussion. In Vatican Square stands the world's second most famous Egyptian obelisk. They actually had it shipped in from the Middle East. What's a real obelisk from Egypt that honored pagan gods doing in St. Peter's Square? I'd like to know too. All I can tell you is this: the official story of everything is a lie. Getting back to D.C., what is a goddess that has ties to ancient Rome doing atop the Capitol Dome? There's a giant statue of a woman up there if you haven't noticed. Most people haven't. Is it Columbia? Persephone? Who is it? Who the hell is what they tell us, this goddess of freedom? Goddess of freedom. Give me a break. They tell us that in Wikipedia and all the dumbed down sources for the masses. The real answer is something else. I'm telling you, it's obvious. Wikipedia just introduced me to something called the Goddess of Freedom. Does she have a sister I could meet? Why would the U.S. have a goddess atop any building for any reason? What does that have to do with this country's founding, traditions, culture, or history? We see a goddess in New York Harbor, and now we have a goddess atop the Capitol Dome. Just another coincidence, I guess. Finally, for some odd reason, we have the land for the construction of Capitol Hill in D.C. donated by Francis Pope. Today we have Pope Francis as the first Jesuit pope in Rome. This is not an impossible coincidence. Popes choose their name. He never grew up as Francis, nor the other one Benedict, nor the former John Paul. Maybe he chose Pope Francis exactly because Francis Pope donated the land. I don't see anything like this as coincidence anymore. On a related note, if you just stop at somebody on the street or on the corner and say, why do they call it the White House? People will kind of, well, I don't know. Because it's bright white? Yeah, according to official sources, they would actually be right. The official sources, as usual, are all lies. White House history tells us that there's a need to cover the fire that the British set after the War of 1812. Somehow they got to the White House and they lit it on fire, like everything else. They'll tell you about the need to seal porous stone with some sort of protective whitewash. Ridiculous. Almost all of the old streets lining Paris and London are some sort of stone. None of it is white to seal it. Do you believe that dumbed down version that intentionally hides the truth? Or will you consider that there's yet another tie to Rome? The White House was likely named after Andrew White, the Jesuit founder of Maryland and the first archbishop in the United States. There's that pesky Vatican influence again, and another tribute to Rome that's not supposed to exist in a sea of Protestants. Amazingly, we have even more Rome influence hidden in plain sight. Do you think Washington, D.C. is named the District of Columbia after a made-up female mascot called Columbia that had no historical significance to anybody in the United States at the time? Or does this make sense? It's a tribute to the Catholic explorer Christopher Columbus. Columbia. Columbus. Of course, Chris's story is a fairy tale as well. The Vikings, who had been coming to North America for about 400 years prior to Chris, would have something to say about Columbus discovering America. Like when old Chris landed in America for the first time on his ship, there's two Vikings, Sven and Igor, were sitting around a fire on a beach roasting some fish. They lifted up their grog to Chris and said, "You're late, asshole!" Part 2. U.S. federal spending is approaching an unimaginable sum. What does Joe the citizen get for about $4 trillion spent a year? If you're reading this from outside the United States, I'm sure you've noticed similar trends in your country, where your central government just grows and grows and grows. Spending numbers abroad won't be as perverse as in the United States, but the theme is the same pretty much all over the world. The central or federal government grows to a massive size, while authority is taken away from local governments and jurisdictions. The exponential rise in central power never ends. There's more people, more agencies, more spending, and of course, more debt. Control is always amassed by the central authority and never given back or distributed back to local jurisdictions. Think about the United States budget that I personally nicknamed Jabba the Hutt. It's about $4 trillion a year. Most human beings cannot even mentally grasp how large the number 1 trillion is. It's truly mind-boggling to think of something you know and then be given a description of what 1 trillion of those things might look like. For example, if you had 1 trillion old wooden rulers, 12 inches or a foot, you could probably lay a line from New York to Los Angeles and you'd have about 99% of them left unused. Now, I don't know exactly if that's accurate, but these exercises yield mind-boggling images associated with the number 1 trillion. 1 trillion Oprah Winfrey bellies would engulf the entire solar system, for example. Nobody ever stops to think about this. What do you get as a citizen for about 4 trillion spent every year? Incredibly, most people will be stumped and say the same 2 or 3 things if you just stop somebody on the street or in the park. Oh, we get military protection. All right, I'll give you that. But it's about 400 billion of unnecessary spending out of the 600 and something billion. It's probably 600 billion of unnecessary spending. We'll give you the 4. The U.S. has never been attacked. Oh, please don't tell me about Pearl Harbor. Go do some research. People also will say, we get schools. We get schools for that money, 4 trillion a year. No. Federal government doesn't pay for your local schools and school districts. We get roads and bridges. No, over 90% of that is done locally at the state level. Most seniors get Social Security and Medicare. Fine. I'll give you that. I'll acknowledge that particular overspending abomination is actually a big part of the federal government. But how the hell do you account for $4 trillion? After we get all the basic things out of the way, when you stop somebody in the park, here's where the problem begins for 99% of people that you ask to consider this. They won't be able to come up with one more thing, or more than 1 or 2 things of any significance that they, quote, get for the astronomical number of 4 trillion a year spent. They'll grasp for things, though, out of desperation with no financial consequence, just to add to their list and say things like, oh, we get the Smithsonian Institute, which is now the Smithsonian Institution. We get the nice shiny buildings on the mall. In comparison to trillions spent, this cost pennies to maintain as a ratio. It's likely saying to balance your household budget, you'll consider giving up a box of Tic Tacs every other month. This type of spending doesn't mean crap. The tertiary stuff, the new museums, putting the space shuttle in the aeronautical museum, that doesn't mean squat when it comes to budgets. But that's all people will be able to come up with. Park maintenance, no. Who knows where this money's going? Let's use a ridiculous example to show people what's really going on with defense spending, for example. And that's just a little $700 billion, around $700 billion a year. That's a small piece. Let's use this example because defense spending is absolutely unnecessary. The United States has never been attacked. Think about it. Let's just go through this. What if your uncle, who lives across town, spent $75,000 a year on home security? He has two monitoring programs like ADT. He has drones that take off when motion detectors are activated by squirrels. He has fence and barbed wire, which are replaced new every few years when the existing structure was just fine. He has a few men who sit in a tower that he constructed in his backyard. He doesn't even let Domino's come in and drive up with a pizza without a canine, bob-sniffing dog being walked around the car on a leash and having that mirror shoved underneath the car. When you ask your uncle, why does he do all of that, and you inquire about recent break-ins and has there been violence in the neighborhood, your uncle says, well, we've never had an incident in the neighborhood. There's never been a theft in the entire town since 1776. But the same gang came back again for a bit in 1812. Let him try it again. Now, that's fine. Your uncle can spend what he wants if it's his own money. But what if his home security spending was taking food and medicine away from his wife, your aunt? What if all the ridiculous security measures your uncle was taking came out of your aunt's pension? Or pretend that that's your taxes. See the problem? If you divert even half of defense spending to health care, your health insurance would be about $50 a month, and you wouldn't need 5 weeks to see a doctor. Why people aren't outraged by this is beyond mind-boggling. Part 3. Where does money come from? The most important object in all the world to most people, and 99 point whatever percent of them don't know where it comes from. Sure, you have a $10 bill in your wallet, but it didn't originally come from the greasy pizza guy who handed it to you, did it? Nobody knows, for the most part, where money comes from. Think about that for a moment. It's like this. Imagine if there was only one food on the entire planet, apples, and nobody knew where they came from, trees. Now, some dummy on the street may like the Kardashians. And you could stop that dummy and say, tell me all about the Kardashians. I heard you like the Kardashians. Well, that dummy could tell you all about Kim's relationship with Kanye, how they got together, the fake jewelry robbery, Khloe's situation with that dope Lamar Odom, and all the other nonsense about the Kardashians. Now, back to money, which is far more important to that dummy in their lives than the Kardashians, and that same dummy has no idea where money comes from. They don't even know how money comes into existence. People have no clue why there's some bizarre pyramid on the back of the dollar bill or why a strange eye with an eyebrow stares up at them when they try to buy something. They can't tell you what annuit culptus means or e pluribus unum or why it says in God we trust when the supposed left of this country has been raving and railing about the separation of church and state for centuries. They'll protest in the rain and sleet to get a mural of the Ten Commandments removed from a local courthouse. But they don't make a peep or a sound about in God we trust on all of the money. But almost no one knows about money, and the main thing to understand is the creation of it must be attached to a debt instrument. When a business or a household gets into debt for a new building, a new house, a new car, the loan itself generates new money. As discussed in prior sections, this is money that was made up and never existed in the system before the loan was originated. We hear about the Fed, quote, printing money to stimulate the economy. They aren't just dropping it from helicopters. The new billions made up on a computer are used to buy debt or bundles of bad mortgages. The point is, new money must come from new debt. Money, debt. Money comes into existence, must be attached to debt. Somewhere must be going into debt. That is the key part to remember. Therefore, the economy cannot grow by definition without new massive debt. Therefore, the national debt, quite literally, can never be paid back. Oh, it's much worse than that. At this point, it can never even be paid down, not even a bit. Sure, they might come out in a certain quarter and say, "Oh, wow, we had a surplus." It'll be a tiny little news headline, and then they will return right back to debt because it has to be that way, or the system would implode. No one was ever taught in school where money comes from, because to understand that is halfway to exposing the biggest scam in human history. How many finance and economic professors have told their students in college that the national debt can never be paid back? Probably none of them have. How many of those professors even realize it themselves? I don't know. Probably about half, but a shockingly large number of these professors probably don't even realize it themselves. I'll go out on a limb and say that. Last part. What is the Federal Reserve, or the Fed? Thankfully, tens of thousands of people are waking up to this aspect of our rigged reality, this aspect of the massive fraud presented to us. However, 95% of the people on the street would still say something dumb like this. "Oh, the Fed is a branch of the United States government related to the Treasury and banks, and they also set interest rates. Oh, do I get a gold star?" Of course, if a major component of a story is wrong, then it's all wrong. True, the Fed does set interest rates, whatever that means. That's only one part of something that anybody will get right when trying to tell you what the Fed is. When the United States needs to create or print money, it's done by the Fed. However, the Fed is, of course, as you know, not part of the government at all. The Fed is a collection of private banks like JP Morgan, Citibank, and Wells Fargo. Typical conversation to wake someone up about the truth of the Fed in a coffee shop may go something like this. George here is asking his friend Ted, "The Fed is private banks? They can just print up whatever money they want? Well, what banks are part of the Fed, Ted?" "Nobody knows who makes up the Fed, George." "What do you mean, nobody knows, Ted?" "Did I stutter? Like I just said, George. Outside of their little club, nobody really knows who's behind the curtain of the Fed." The Congress doesn't know?" "Well, they have a general idea, but the Fed has never allowed an audit of itself by your elected representatives." An association of private banks can just print up or make up money whenever they want?" "Yep, they sure can." "Well, how do they create the money, Ted?" "On a keyboard, George. How else?" "Well, surely the government somewhere has oversight, and what they create must be somehow then later removed from the system in the future." "Nope." "So, in a way, you're saying that private bankers can whip out their keyboard and create as much money as they want?" "No, I didn't say in a way. Be plain. Private bankers can, on their keyboards, create as much money as they want, whenever they want." "What? What does the Fed do with most of the money that it creates on the keyboard then?" "Well, they use the made up money to buy debt instruments that are made up by the guy across the street at the Treasury, but they use a bunch of the made up money to buy toxic assets like mortgages, CDOs, and junk related securities. Stuff that, of course, nobody wants. The Fed has to buy up to save the economy. But a lot of those assets still have some value, right? They're not all worthless mortgages, right?" "Correct. There's still billions of dollars of value." So let me get this straight. They get a hold of billions of dollars of real estate with money that they made up on a keyboard from a computer, money that they just brought into existence in about 5 seconds. Yep. Well, where else does the made up Fed money go? They lend it to individual banks and they lend it to the United States government. What? Lending it to the United States government implies the government has to repay the money with interest. Yep. The Fed demands interest on the money that they created from nothing on a keyboard? Yes, George. They get interest paid to them on made up money. It's hard to believe things really work this way, Ted. Can you prove this system exists without me having to do hours and hours of research? I don't have time for that. I'm binge watching. Yes, and I can prove it to you quite simply. Look at the national debt, now in excess of about $21 trillion. If the government could just create money like the Fed does, why would they need to be even $1 in debt? Think about that. The government could create money instead of the private banks. They wouldn't need to be in any debt. They wouldn't need to put you in any debt. They would just create what they need. Instead, they look to the private bankers to create what they need. The government would just make up what they need and float it into the system that way without the debt. Yeah, right. Why doesn't the Treasury then just print the money that it needs and not put us into debt to begin with? Because the bankers don't allow that, George. Well, that would imply the bankers are in control. No, it doesn't imply anything, George. Be plain. The bankers are in control.